He carried the Empress's daughter out of the burning wreck. Hours later, 8 soldiers were at his door. If you enjoy this channel, please take a moment to check if you're subscribed. The air over the Viridian Reach tasted like copper and burned ionized air, a metallic tang Richie had long associated with high-grade kinetic weaponry and impending disaster. His armored skiff banked hard, scraping the cliff face as he dropped toward the valley floor. The ruins of the Cathar diplomatic convoy stark against the gray, pulverized earth. The transport, designed to resist conventional anti-vehicle fire, was a mangled husk, twisted into the landscape like a piece of abstract, agonizing sculpture. It wasn't a clean takedown. It was a furious, professional ambush. Richie killed his thrusters 50 meters out, letting the skiff settle into a cluster of high, jagged rocks. He moved immediately, his movements economical, a human predator in matte gray combat gear against a battlefield of silver Cathar wreckage. The ambushers were gone, or so the initial sensory data suggested, but Richie trusted only his eyes and the tension in his own muscles. He carried the scars of men who trusted automation over instinct. He found the access hatch blown inward. The thick Cathar shielding curled like tin foil. He didn't bother with the intricate locking mechanism. A sharp, precise kick dislodged the mangled plate, and he dropped into the darkness. The interior was a charnel house of glittering silver blood and torn Cathar flesh. The ambassador, the chief diplomat he was supposed to be guarding from a distance, was already dead, slumped against the bulkhead. Richie didn't pause. His target was the secondary priority, the sole remaining occupant the distress beacon still registered, the Empress's daughter, Junessa. He heard the faint, ragged rasp of breath, thin and strained, coming from the reinforced comms core at the back. Cathar security. Richie's voice was low, filtered, and entirely without deference. I am extraction. State your status. A voice, high and sharp with cultural outrage, even through the pain, cut through the hiss of escaping air. Uninjured. Do not approach this compartment. I am Junessa, daughter of the Empress. You will maintain protocol distance and await my command. Richie ignored the title and the command completely. Protocol distance was for state dinners and sterile negotiation rooms. This was a burning wreck, the deck plates beneath his boots already heating to dangerous levels. He located the source of the jam, a piece of shrapnel that had fused the emergency release mechanism on the comms core door. He pressed his gloved hand against the alien metal, reading the thermal signature, calculating the stress points. I am breaching the compartment now, he stated, pulling a compact, specialized kinetic cutter from his hip. If you are capable of movement, clear the rear wall. You have 3 seconds. He didn't wait for her reply, which was sure to be another furious rejection of his authority. The cutter spat a high-energy arc, carving a perfect, screaming line across the jammed doorframe. The heat and acrid sterilizer smell intensified, mixing with a strangely sweet alien blood scent. Richie put his shoulder into the door, and the compromised seal blew, sending the door flying inward. The core was small, barely large enough for 2, and Junessa was huddled against the far wall. Emerald green skin, stark against the burnt silver of the compartment, was marred by superficial lacerations, and her long, vibrant purple hair was matted with grime and blood, but her eyes, wide, golden, and blazing, met his with pure aristocratic terror and rage. Her posture, even while crouching in a fetal position, was one of command, demanding he halt. Human, stop! You violate my person. I order you to stand down and wait for my guard, she hissed, pushing herself back against the melting panel. Richie saw what she couldn't. The structural beam hanging precariously above them was giving way, stressed by the external fire. Her protocol would kill them both in the next 30 seconds. He knew the Cathar had intense cultural taboos about physical contact, especially between genders and with the imperial lineage, viewing it as an act of ownership or contamination, but he didn't care. His job was extraction. He took 2 long, powerful strides across the compartment, closing the distance before she could react. Junessa scrambled, raising a trembling hand in a reflexive gesture of imperial defense. Richie didn't even slow down. His left arm locked around her waist, crushing her tightly against the armored plates of his chest. His right hand went immediately behind her neck, palm cradling the base of her skull, forcing her head down and inwards. The contact was brutal, possessive, and absolute. The full, overwhelming force of human physical authority exerted over a much slighter alien frame. She gasped, a broken sound of shock and pain, unable to fight the iron grip that had claimed her body. "No time for that," Richie ground out, his voice a low rumble vibrating against her ear. "We go now." As he turned, leveraging her weight against his center of gravity, the structural beam finally failed. The metal screeched, and a secondary explosive charge, a delayed booby trap, detonated outside the comms core. Flames engulfed the corridor he had just entered. Richie moved, not running, but a controlled, explosive surge of acceleration. He carried her like a piece of equipment, completely disregarding her status, her dignity, and her terror, focused only on getting them clear of the inferno. He burst out of the wreckage into the choking, coppery air of the valley. The fire immediately backlit the ruin, casting dancing orange shadows across Junessa's terrified, rigid face. He did not slow until he reached the relative security of his skiff, 50 meters away. Only then did he stop, dropping her gently but quickly to the ground behind the cover of the rocks. She lay gasping, her green skin slick with sweat and the blood of her own minor wounds, the vibrant purple hair spread over the gray dust. She was alive, but culturally shattered, staring at the strong, scarred hands that had just violated every sacred law of her hegemony. "Do not touch me again," she finally managed, her voice shaking, clutching the part of her waist where his hand had been. Richie simply leaned against the rock, checking his tactical display. "You were seconds from being charcoal," he said, his breathing hard but controlled. "Get up, you ride in the co-pilot seat. We have hostile contacts incoming." The immediate danger was over, but the consequence of his necessary intimate savagery had just begun. Richie's remote hideout was less a base and more a fortified maintenance shed, tucked into a ravine 15 clicks from the wreck site. It was pragmatic, camouflaged, and currently choked with the heavy silence of two utterly incompatible beings. Junessa sat on a field cot, rigid and alert, meticulously cleaning the grime and drying blood from her tailored suit with a medical wipe, refusing any aid Richie offered. The human sat opposite her, stripping his heavy tactical vest and checking the power cells of his remaining kinetic rifle. He moved with a heavy, efficient economy that Junessa found repulsive and utterly mesmerizing. His presence filled the small space, a silent, inescapable statement of power. He was physically large, his frame corded and dense, bearing the faint scarring of past conflicts across his arms and jawline. "You have performed an unauthorized extraction," Junessa stated, her voice tight, formalizing the breach. Her gold eyes never left his face. "You committed the most profound cultural violation in the hegemony. You will be arrested and penalized by my people." Richie paused, pulling a fresh magazine from a storage locker. "I saved your life. That tends to override cultural violation in my line of work." "It does not," she countered immediately, her head lifting, restoring the regal tilt that the terror had briefly stripped away. "The Cathar value protocol and lineage above survival. You laid hands upon the Empress's daughter without explicit, sanctioned allowance. That act, that claim of ownership through physical force, is punishable by full confiscation of your assets, your person, and likely your life." "Noted," Richie said flatly, securing the magazine. He looked at her then, meeting her blazing stare. "I saved the target. My contract is fulfilled. Now we wait for your military recovery team." A sharp chime broke the heavy atmosphere. Richie crossed the room and activated his encrypted satellite comms link. A small 3D schematic appeared, displaying 3 heavy-duty Cathar military shuttles making a rapid descent toward their location. "That's fast," Richie muttered, accessing the IFF signature. 2 transports, 1 command shuttle. Too many for a simple retrieval. They shouldn't be here for hours. "They have mobilized a rapid response unit," Junessa announced, rising stiffly from the cot. She straightened her suit, her posture a desperate attempt to reestablish the imperial distance the wreck had stripped away. "I will wait outside. Do not leave this structure, human. They will deal with you first." Richie watched the schematics. 8 distinct, heavy infantry signatures were dropping from the command shuttle. 8 soldiers. The number itself felt precise, heavy, and immediate. "No, you'll wait right here," Richie contradicted, pulling his vest back on. The recovery team is supposed to be 3 personnel and a medic. This is a platoon-strength insertion, and they are moving tactically. It's an arrest team, Princess, not a rescue party. Junessa flinched at the casual use of her title. Before she could retort, the sound hit the ravine. The thunderous, heavy thrum of military thrusters and the heavy clank of armored boots hitting the ground outside. The building shuddered. Richie pushed her roughly behind a stack of supplies, his actions instantly aggressive and protective. He drew a specialized energy pistol, switching the settings from stun to kill. "Stay down," he commanded, his eyes focused on the single entry point. A deep, non-human voice, amplified and resonant, cut through the thin walls of the shed. "Richie, designation human contractor. Surrender your weapons and exit the structure immediately. You are under arrest for the violation of Imperial personnel protocol. Hand over the princess daughter, Junessa." Richie shifted his weight, preparing for a tactical breach. This was it, the consequence. "Commander," Junessa suddenly called out, her voice clear, sharp, and ringing with absolute authority. She pushed herself into the light, ignoring Richie's sharp hand gesture to stay hidden. "This is Princess Junessa. You will not engage the human." The amplified voice hesitated, clearly thrown off script. "Princess daughter, we are here for your extraction and his immediate detention. Step away from the perpetrator." "I said stop," Junessa repeated, louder now, her emerald skin pale, but her resolve absolute. She stepped fully into the center of the small room, facing the door. "My person has been compromised by the enemy action. This human, Richie, performed a necessary physical extraction and protection duty. Per the Imperial Edicts, Subclause 4B, the Battlefield Expediency Act, I hereby declare him my temporary possessed asset." Richie froze, his eyes widening in stunned incomprehension. Possessed asset? The commander outside hesitated for a long, painful moment. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. "Princess daughter, that edict is archaic. It is reserved only for situations of extreme duress, to legitimize temporary contact until cultural cleansing can be performed. It cannot be applied to a foreign entity." The commander finally roared, disbelief mixing with fury. "It can and is applied," Junessa shot back, her voice shaking but holding firm. "He is not arrested. He is not a perpetrator. He is a tool of my immediate survival. He is mine under the edict. I command his proximity. Commander, you will stand down your 8 soldiers, secure the perimeter, and await my next order. I am under threat, and he is now my protection. The protocol is satisfied. Obey the heir's command." Silence descended, broken only by the angry, strained breathing of the Cathar commander outside. Junessa turned her back to the door and looked at Richie. Her golden eyes were glittering with a complex mix of terror, pride, and utter necessity. "You may have saved my life, human," she whispered, her voice fierce, "but you are now my property. This is the only way I can keep you from being dismantled, and the only way I can keep your capabilities near me. Welcome to the hegemony asset." The Cathar commander, a tall, stern male with obsidian scales glinting beneath his silver armor, stood directly outside the sealed door, his breathing ragged with barely contained fury. The 8 soldiers remained positioned, their heavy kinetic rifles lowered but pointed squarely at the exit. The tension was suffocating. Inside, Junessa turned to face Richie, the blazing light of necessity in her eyes. Richie still held the energy pistol, his focus unwavering on the thin door. "Explain that," Richie demanded, his voice dangerously low. He kept his body angled, ready for a breach, but his attention was split by the legal bombshell she'd dropped. "Possessed asset? What the hell does that mean, culturally?" Junessa walked toward him, moving with a stiff, careful grace, her green skin faintly reflecting the tactical red lights of the compound. "It means I have temporarily purchased your life, human. The Edict of Possession is an ancient military doctrine. If a member of the imperial family is rescued by an unsanctioned male, rather than executing the rescuer immediately for the violation of contact, they can be claimed as property. It is a humiliation, but it is legal." "Property," Richie repeated, the word tasting like rust. He holstered the pistol, but his hands didn't relax. "And the catch?" "The catch is the contact is now sanctioned," she whispered, her voice tightening. She raised a trembling hand, indicating his chest. To save you from immediate arrest, I have to legally justify your proximity and your methods. I must be able to order you to touch me, to command your protection. You are no longer Richie, the contractor. You are merely asset. You exist solely for my survival, and that is all the commander can report. This was worse than an arrest. It was a complete psychological power play, forcing him into a role of intimate, dominant servitude. Richie's jaw tightened. He read the fear beneath her explanation. She had chosen this to keep his immense capabilities on her side. You believe the threat is internal, then, Richie stated, switching immediately to tactical assessment, sidestepping the infuriating cultural politics. The commander's arrival was too fast, too aggressive for a simple extraction. They aren't here to rescue you. They're here to delay until the real killers catch up. Junessa nodded curtly. The ambassador was a low-value target. I was the true objective. The commander is Zorak. He reports directly to the Starguard Command, the very force I suspect is compromised. If he genuinely wanted to help, he would have come alone, discreetly, and rushed me out. Instead, he brought a squad of arresters and made a scene. She moved closer, her proximity a calculated risk. Richie instinctively shifted away, but she took another step, closing the distance, forcing the issue of the edict. Her eyes, golden and intense, searched his face. I must order you to remain within arm's reach at all times, she stated, her breath catching in her throat as she gave the command. Asset, I command you to secure the perimeter and inform me of any threat to my person. Use whatever barbaric methods you deem necessary. You must remain physically capable of shielding me. Richie watched her, seeing the conflict, the Empress's daughter, giving up her dignity and control over her own body to a human just to secure her life. He saw the fire in her eyes, the political ruthlessness that matched his own pragmatic survival skills. Fine, he conceded, the single word sharp. He moved to the small console displaying the surrounding terrain. But your commander is dragging his feet, and his soldiers are positioned to observe, not defend. He pulled up the extended-range sensors. The commander, Zorak, had ordered his 8 soldiers to form a wide cordon, claiming to secure the landing zone. In reality, they were making a lot of noise, giving Richie and Junessa time, and giving the actual assassins time to regroup and locate them. There, Richie pointed to a weak, fluctuating thermal signature 20 miles north, moving fast on ground bikes. The remnants of the initial ambush team. They are using a coalition-grade tracker, probably planted during the initial attack. They know our general location. How long until they reach us? Junessa asked, her voice tight with professional anxiety, the fear momentarily eclipsing the cultural tension. 30 minutes max, Richie said. He turned and grabbed a sturdy piece of gear, a compact, high-powered comms jammer, and tossed it to her. Zorak is a stone wall. We need to force his hand to get transport, or we need to leave now. He moved to the small back room, a narrow server corridor used for storing backup components and field diagnostics. He checked the structural integrity. It was the smallest, most reinforced space in the building. Richie didn't ask her. He simply grabbed her arm, a rough, non-negotiable grip this time, and pulled her into the dark, cramped server room. She gasped, a low, immediate sound of shock at the renewed sanctioned contact. They will be using kinetic fire soon, he explained, his voice hard. This is the only place strong enough to hold. Stay quiet and stay close. That's your first and only command asset. He released her arm, but the damage was done. They were pressed together in the dark, the scent of his warm, durable gear and the low, masculine musk of his fear-free professionalism completely engulfing her. Her breath hitched. She was legally his. He was physically hers to command for protection. In the suffocating confinement, the line between possession and protection began to blur. The server corridor was hot, small, and smelled faintly of burning capacitors. Richie stood braced against the metallic frame, listening to the strained silence outside, his powerful frame consuming the majority of the confined space. Junessa was wedged between him and the humming server banks, entirely reliant on his solid mass for stability. The legal formality of the Possessed Asset Edict had changed everything. She was now acutely aware of his body, not as a threat to her culture, but as a sanctioned, overwhelming presence. Every shift of his shoulders, every controlled intake of his breath, was amplified in the oppressive intimacy of the space. Her hands, initially held defensively against her chest, now rested against the hard-packed muscle of his lower back, stabilizing herself against the pressure. Richie spoke in a near whisper, his voice a gravely vibration against her ear. "They're testing the perimeter. Light kinetic rounds, standard sweep pattern. Zorak is playing his part." "He is waiting for the trackers," Junessa whispered back, her voice startlingly close to his neck. She was aware that she was physically touching him with every millimeter of her front side, a transgression that, until moments ago, would have demanded his death. Now, it was a necessity, a command. She tried to find repulsion, but the intense, musky warmth radiating off his body was dangerously compelling. He shifted, raising one forearm to check a tactical wrist pad, and the movement pressed his hip tightly against hers. Junessa inhaled sharply, a sound lost in the server hum. She was a Cathar noble, raised in the strictest courts, where even a glance could be misconstrued. The lack of respect, the sheer animal intensity of this human male who had claimed her in the most brutal way, was breaking the carefully constructed walls of her imperial persona. "The first group is 10 minutes out," Richie reported, his focus absolute. He seemed completely oblivious to the sensual torture the confinement was inflicting on her. "I'm forcing Zorak's hand. He needs to realize his staged defense is about to be overrun by a third party. They won't believe it until they see it." Richie reached around her, his heavy arm brushing fiercely across her chest as he accessed a concealed control panel near the server unit. Junessa bit back a gasp. His physical indifference was maddening, confirming his view of her as purely an asset to be maneuvered, not an Empress's daughter to be respected. But it was exactly this lack of deference, this pure, unadorned focus on efficiency and survival, that was pulling her under. She pressed her palm against the flat, powerful plane of his stomach, steadying herself. Her action was involuntary, a response to the dizzying rush of panic and desire. Richie registered the touch immediately. He paused his work and looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers. "Asset steady," he murmured, his voice now lower, rougher. "Focus." The word asset, a declaration of ownership, had the opposite of its intended effect. It was an acknowledgement of the intimacy she had legally commanded. "I am steady," she managed, her voice strained. "I am observing your methods. You rely on brute force and surprise." "I rely on efficiency," he corrected, turning his attention back to the panel. "Their military doctrine is rigid. They use superior numbers and coordinated, structured fire. We use speed, leverage, and the willingness to go for the throat when they're expecting a feint." He slammed his hand down on a sequence of controls. Outside, a loud, controlled explosion echoed. A remote charge Richie had planted moments before the soldiers arrived, meant to look like a delayed mine. "Now," Richie said, his voice rising, "I've just confirmed to Zorak that the environment is compromised. He has to react or he loses plausible deniability." A sudden, sharp barrage of kinetic fire erupted outside, closer than the initial perimeter sweep. The commander was reacting, but weakly. "Commander Zorak!" Junessa shouted toward the door, her voice commanding, overriding the noise. "You are being probed. Demand transport immediately. I will not be taken here." Her commanding assertion of power, even in such a dire situation, stirred something primal in Richie. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the raw, beautiful face smeared with soot, the emerald skin shining with determination, and the gold eyes that were finally completely focused on survival rather than protocol. Richie leaned in, his mouth close to her ear, the heat of his breath startling. "Good. Now we see if he's a loyal soldier or a co-conspirator." The pressure from the incoming assassins, combined with the extreme heat of the confined space and the sanctioned intimacy of their physical contact, was becoming explosive. Junessa felt the slow, terrifying realization of the truth. Zorak and his 8 soldiers were not trying to save her. They were sacrificing her. The assassins were closing fast, and the commander was simply waiting for the inevitable. The coup leader had already won this tactical engagement. The noise outside became frantic. The kinetic fire had escalated from probing shots to a continuous, grinding assault. Richie could hear the distinct sound of alien ground vehicles, The assassins were less than a kilometer away, ignoring Zorak's token resistance. Richie pulled Junessa tighter against him, his back to the server bank, preparing to meet the door with lethal force. Zorak is incompetent or compromised, Richie stated, the assessment cold and final. He has the assets to hold, but he's making noise and firing high, deliberately missing. Junessa pressed her face against his armor, breathing in the smell of his sweat and gun oil. The heat in the room was immense, and the shared desperation had finally dissolved the last cultural restraints. She raised her head, her eyes fixed on his. "It is not incompetence," Junessa admitted, her voice low and broken. This was the moment of full, painful political surrender. "It is betrayal. The attack on the ambassador was a feint. The coup leader is Krylos, the head of the Star Guard's high command, and a rival to my mother's authority." Richie stopped, the gravity of the name making even his battle-hardened composure waver for a millisecond. "Star Guard? That means the assets surrounding us, the 8 soldiers, are his men." "They are," Junessa confirmed, the admission agonizing. "They came fast, not to rescue me, but to lock me down. Zorak has orders to delay my extraction, ensuring the assassins can find me here, trapped." She looked up at him, her vulnerability raw. "The edict was necessary not just to save your life, but to keep a weapon near me. You are the only thing they cannot predict, the only thing that is not compromised by Krylos." Richie understood instantly. She hadn't claimed him out of cultural spite. She had claimed him out of desperate necessity, knowing his human capacity for unconventional, brutal warfare was their only route out of the hegemony's internal trap. "They're not waiting for transport, Princess. They're waiting for my death, and then yours," Richie said, his focus sharpening into lethal resolve. He had been played, legally possessed, but now he had a clear target: survival against a compromised Imperial Guard and a pack of assassins. The door to the corridor shuddered violently as a sustained laser blast hit the external plating. They didn't have minutes, they had seconds. "Zorak is holding the perimeter, claiming he can't leave his post," Junessa whispered, her hand rising to grip his neck in a fierce, urgent claim. "He needs to maintain the illusion of defense. We need to breach the rear and leave them holding a burning building." "Agreed," Richie responded. He didn't waste time on a weapon. He located the weak point in the server corridor's rear wall, a ventilation shaft access panel, and struck it twice, brutally, with the reinforced heel of his boot. The high-grade aluminum bent inward, tearing with a shrieking sound. He grabbed the comms jammer she was holding and tossed it into the open space of the main shed. The small device emitted a high-pitched whine as it activated. "That'll give them 5 seconds of electronic disorientation and cover our exit noise," Richie stated. He turned to Junessa. Her eyes were wide, glittering with a mix of terror and exhilarating trust. "Asset, I command you," she said, the words no longer formal but a desperate guttural plea. "Get us out of here. Do what you must." Richie didn't hesitate. He knew the jungle outside was treacherous, and she couldn't run. He grabbed her by the waist and in one rapid, powerful movement lifted her clean off the floor and threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Junessa gasped, a sound of pure, strangled shock. The cultural violation was so absolute, so complete. Her body was utterly subjected to his will, pressed against the unforgiving curvature of his shoulder, her purple hair dangling down his back. It wasn't a rescue. It was a military maneuver, utterly dominating and painfully intimate. "Hold on tight, Asset," Richie commanded, his voice muffled by the exertion. He kicked through the rest of the mangled panel and burst out the back wall, plunging them into the chaotic mess of the ravine behind the shed. The ground was rocky and uneven. Richie took off, his powerful legs driving him forward, his human endurance immediately obvious. Junessa clung to him, her arms wrapped around his neck, her legs automatically locking around his waist to maintain her hold. She was experiencing the terrifying, overwhelming surge of his physical power, the engine of a human built for relentless, unforgiving combat. Behind them, the shed erupted in fire and heavy weapon noise as the assassins breached the front door, realizing they had been tricked. Richie heard Zorak shouting orders that were too late, too slow. The 8 soldiers watched as the human carried their princess, their property, out of the burning shell and vanished into the wild. In the suffocating grip of his power, racing through the dense terrain, Junessa whispered a single word into the back of his neck, a genuine, desperate surrender. Go. The jungle of the Viridian Reach was thick, acidic, and entirely unforgiving. Richie ran. He ran for 40 minutes without pause, his breathing regulated to the efficiency of a tuned machine. He kept Junessa over his shoulder for the first 20, the brutal proximity a necessity. Her weight, light but awkward, was merely another variable in his internal physics equation. He finally slowed near a shallow, muddy river, dropping her gently onto a moss-covered boulder. He moved immediately, pulling out a multi-spectrum sensor and scanning the sky and the dense canopy. Junessa, trembling and winded, immediately rubbed the skin where his hand had gripped her waist. The raw, exhilarating fear was replaced by a dizzying awareness of his capability. She had been subjected to the most intense physical exertion of her life, and the human had barely broken a sweat. They will be using low-altitude drones and thermal optics, Richie stated, his voice a low, rough rumble. He checked the sole of her boot. We need to cool your core temperature and break your heat signature. The Cathar military is designed for sustained, organized fire, not silent pursuit and chaos. Zorak knows this terrain, Junessa countered, still gasping slightly. He is trained for extraction under fire. He is trained for extraction with vehicles and aerial support, Richie corrected, pulling a small reflective foil sheet from his pack. He spread it out, revealing a dark, viscous paste. Your people rely too much on technology to cover basic inefficiencies. We rely on the physical engine. He dipped his hand into the paste, a crude, human-made thermal suppressant, and smeared it roughly onto his neck and face. Then, without asking, he reached for her. Junessa flinched back, a residual cultural reaction. What are you doing? That is messy. It's survival, Richie stated, his voice flat, but his eyes intense. Your skin radiates heat differently than mine. The drones will spot you first. I commanded you to stay capable of being shielded. This is what that means. He gently but firmly cupped her chin, tilting her head up, forcing her submission. Junessa's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This contact was no longer violent or rushed. It was slow, deliberate, and fiercely intimate. Richie's rough, scarred thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away soot, and then applying the cool, pungent paste. His touch was clinical, yet possessive. He coated her throat, her jawline, and the exposed parts of her ears. She watched his face, inches from hers. The defined lines, the absolute focus, the lack of hesitation. His hands were large, disproportionately powerful compared to her delicate frame, but moving with controlled, almost tender efficiency. Your methods are primitive, she observed, the words barely a whisper. They work, Richie replied, his voice still low. He finished her face and moved to her upper arms, coating the exposed emerald skin. They heard a faint, high-pitched whine from above, a drone. Richie grabbed her and dragged her under a dense, low-hanging root structure. The space was barely enough for them both, forcing them into full chest-to-chest contact. Junessa's hands immediately went to his back, gripping the durable fabric. She could feel his heart hammering, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. This was the raw, undeniable attraction, his focus, his refusal to be anything but the most efficient killer in the environment. The edict allows me to command you, she stated, pressing the point, testing the boundaries of her possession. Richie didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the shadows above. I am protecting my asset. That is the only command I follow. Every resource, every action is dedicated to getting you to the communication point. He was silent then, listening. The drone passed, its thermal optics fooled by the suppressant and the natural cover. The proximity, the shared silence, and the knowledge that his life was dependent on her legal maneuvering while her life was dependent on his raw physicality created an intoxicating loop. Junessa found herself leaning into his strength, wanting more of the possessive control that had terrified her hours ago. She wanted to command him, not as a political shield, but as a release. Richie, the hunter, was unaware of the new, dangerous prey he had unleashed in the Empress's daughter. They moved for hours through the night, traversing canyons and navigating subterranean riverbeds. Richie maintained a relentless, punishing pace, forcing Junessa to rely entirely on the constant, nonverbal communication of his body. He would signal a jump with a slight downward pressure on her hand or indicate a shift in direction by subtly repositioning her. She was a silent, efficient extension of his movement, her physical rigidity completely dissolved by the demands of evasion. As dawn broke, Richie led her to a shallow, dry cave behind a waterfall. It was high, defensible, and had a clear line of sight to the north. "We rest here for 3 hours," Richie announced, his voice hoarse. He immediately began setting up a minimal defensive perimeter, his movements still precise despite the exhaustion. He pulled out emergency rations, tasteless, high-density human nutrient bars. Junessa accepted the bar and sat against the cool rock wall, watching him. Her eyes were no longer terrified, but burning with curiosity and something fiercely protective of her asset. "The commander is not pursuing us with the full force of his detachment," Junessa noted, her voice steady. "He is only following the necessary protocols to make the hunt look convincing for Krylos." "He's tracking the collateral damage," Richie corrected, sitting down to check his rifle. "He knows where we're heading. He's waiting for us to make a mistake." The exhaustion and the intense, enforced intimacy of the past hours had frayed her cultural conditioning completely. She had legally claimed his body, but in practice he had claimed hers, maneuvering her as he saw fit. She needed to assert control, not over the mission, but over the dizzying, intense emotion his protection invoked. "The edict," she began, her voice low. Richie glanced up, his expression guarded. "It states that the asset must comply with all commands necessary for the preservation of the imperial person. That includes commands for comfort and psychological stability." Richie narrowed his eyes. "Get to the point, Princess. We don't have time for legal interpretation." "The point is this enforced proximity," Junessa pressed, rising and taking 2 slow, deliberate steps toward him. She closed the distance he had strategically put between them. "It is psychologically disruptive. It is a powerful cultural weapon. I need to understand the true nature of the possession." She stood over him, her shadow falling across his face. Richie looked up, his strong neck muscles visibly tense. "It means I am your tool," he stated simply. "I will kill for you. I will run for you. Don't confuse that with anything else." Junessa shook her head, the purple hair swinging with a desperate intensity. "You are not a tool. You are a beast. You took me from the wreck, not with respect, but with a ferocious, powerful claim. You commanded me with your body, not my rank. I ordered you to stay capable of shielding me, and you complied by taking complete physical control." She knelt before him, pressing her palms against the armored plates of his knees. It was a complete reversal of status, a surrender disguised as a command. "I command you to acknowledge the intensity of this possession asset," she whispered, her voice husky. "I command you to address the power you have taken and the power I have surrendered. I command you to teach me what true, raw survival demands." Richie gripped her shoulders, his hands firm and unyielding. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sudden, volatile intensity. He read the pure, cultural need in her golden eyes, the desire for the rigid order of her life to be shattered by his primal command. "Survival demands focus, Princess," he ground out, pulling her closer, his face inches from hers. "It demands that everything else, every thought, every sensation be secondary to the objective. Right now, you are the objective." Junessa didn't resist. She closed her eyes, leaning into the overwhelming power that threatened to crush her, yet offered the ultimate shield. She opened her mouth against his, a fierce, desperate claim that admitted her defeat. Richie responded with a controlled, possessive urgency, a powerful, demanding kiss that was both protective and utterly dominant. This was the true, sanctioned intimacy of the edict, a fierce, shared solitude forged in danger. The walls of the cave seemed to close in, leaving only the 2 of them, the hunter and his possessed prize. The passionate urgency was a fleeting, necessary release, a mutual acknowledgement of the impossible tension that had built between them. When they finally broke apart, it was Richie who reasserted control, not out of coldness, but tactical necessity. He lifted Junessa to her feet, his hands lingering on her waist for a millisecond longer than required. The connection was now undeniable, fiercely possessive, and ratified by blood and desperation. The objective is still the comms array, 10 kilometers northeast, Richie stated, his voice tight. They will be expecting us to continue the direct path. Junessa nodded, her eyes bright, her breathing shallow. She had shed the mask of the Empress's daughter. What remained was the sharp, resilient woman who had navigated court politics and battlefield survival. They will be using the main ravine as a choke point, she analyzed, rubbing her lips with the back of her hand. Zorak will position his full squad there to make the arrest seem legitimate. He needs to appear to be saving me from the assassins, not letting them kill me. Richie saw an opportunity. The Cathar, even when compromised, operated on predictable military doctrines. They would use structured defenses. Humans, however, specialized in breaking structure. "We're not going to the choke point," Richie said, pulling a series of explosive charges from his pack. He began fusing them to stones and branches, creating small, almost invisible landmines. "I am going to leave them a gift." "A human gift," Junessa observed, her voice low, watching his brutal efficiency. "A demonstration of your savage pragmatism." "It's the price of protection," Richie corrected, looking up at her, his eyes hard. "They think they're hunting an asset. I'm going to make them realize they're hunting a human who views life as expendable when the target is paramount." He set the trap in the densely forested slope leading to the main ravine, a cascading sequence of kinetic charges designed not just to kill, but to maim and confuse. Richie knew the Thar military prioritized clean, decisive kills. His trap was messy, cruel, and designed to generate chaos and fear. They retreated 50 meters to a rocky outcrop. Richie held Junessa close, his arm securely around her shoulders, shielding her not just from harm, but from the full psychological impact of what was coming. It took only 20 minutes for the first wave of assassins, 3 heavily armed individuals in light armor, to enter the kill zone, tracking the minimal thermal residue Richie had left behind. The first charge detonated beneath the lead assassin's boot. It wasn't large, but it was perfectly positioned to disable and destabilize. The second charge, triggered by the collapse of the first, took out the second assassin's legs, throwing him into the third. The sound was sharp, tearing through the quiet jungle. Screams, distinctly non-human, followed. The third assassin, injured but mobile, began firing wildly at the canopy, breaking formation, his training dissolving into panicked response. Richie watched the scene play out on his microsensor with cold detachment. He watched as the surviving assassin fumbled with his comms, not coordinating but panicking. "See the difference, asset?" Richie whispered into Junessa's hair. "They rely on the collective. When that collective breaks, their efficiency collapses. We are built for individual survival. When the unit fails, the human becomes more dangerous, not less." Junessa watched the chaotic sensor readouts, her body pressed against Richie's rock-solid frame. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach, but beneath the revulsion, a fierce, protective pride bloomed. Her asset was terrifying. Her human was a monster of efficiency. Before the remaining assassin could regroup, a new group of signatures entered the zone. Commander Zorak and the 8 soldiers. Zorak, seeking to maintain the pretense of a proper military response, ordered his men to mop up the remaining assassin. Zorak's voice was relayed through Richie's receiver, tight with disgust. "Secure the perimeter, eliminate the perpetrators. This messy combat is unacceptable." Richie smiled, a predatory curve of his lips. "He hates the chaos. That means my plan worked. He is not capable of predicting the next move because it doesn't follow any protocol he knows." Junessa looked up at him, her golden eyes blazing. "Then let us give him another unpredictable move. Let's lead him straight to the comms array, making him think he is finally cornering his prey." The shared violence had bound them closer than any legal decree. They were no longer 2 separate entities, but a single lethal unit fueled by mutual survival and a fierce, sanctioned passion. Richie and Junessa moved at a swift, tactical pace, leaving a deliberately easy-to-follow but circuitous trail of broken foliage and faint thermal signatures. They had to draw Zorak and his 8 soldiers into the next phase of the trap, the comms array. The Imperial comms relay was perched atop a sharp high mesa, a secure facility that required biometric and Imperial code access, meaning Richie would have to rely on Junessa's access protocols. The array is shielded against external jamming, but the internal security requires manual input, Junessa explained as they reached the final ascent, Richie hauling her up a sheer rock face with effortless power. I need 20 seconds inside the control room to reroute the signal through the throne world's private channel. You need security outside, Richie corrected, reaching the summit and setting her down. He checked the perimeter. No active sensors, only the distant, tightening net of Zorak's hunting party. They are 30 minutes out, maximum. We have 30 minutes to get inside, get the message out, and prepare for a final fight. Richie immediately began setting up his remaining defenses, positioning himself near the narrow entrance, preparing for a close-quarters engagement. Junessa accessed the main control panel using her retinal scan and a complex sequence of hand movements. I am broadcasting to the Empress Ilara, Junessa explained, her fingers flying across the alien controls. I need to tell her everything. The compromised Starguard, Krillos's coup attempt, and Zorak's deliberate delay. Richie watched her, his expression a mixture of admiration and fierce protectiveness. She was the political engine, and he was the shield. The sanctioned intimacy of the edict was now paramount. Talk to me while you work, Asset, Richie commanded, his voice low, a request for constant situational awareness. I need to know your status every second. Junessa looked up at him, a faint flush on her emerald skin. The transmission requires my full concentration. I need you to maintain physical contact. It is necessary for my focus. The command was a desperate lie, a thin veneer over a burning, passionate need to feel his possession as she performed this galaxy-defining political act. Richie didn't question it. He moved behind her, placing his hands firmly on her shoulders, leaning in so his chest was against her back. He was a solid, unyielding wall of muscle, heat, and power. Status, he commanded again. Encryption active. Routing through the secondary Imperial pulse. 10 seconds to upload, Junessa whispered, her voice strained, not by the code but by the intense physical proximity. She was pressed against him, his sheer presence forcing a dizzying focus. She transmitted the comprehensive report detailing the brutal efficiency of the assassins and the calculated betrayal of Zorak and the 8 soldiers. She ended the transmission with a powerful political flourish. Empress Ilara, I confirm that my survival was entirely due to the intervention of the unsanctioned human asset, Richie. His methods, though barbaric, were necessary. I confirm the application of the Edict of Possession and request immediate sanction for the full confiscation of his services as my personal protector, a necessary, brutal shield against the rot in our own command. Do not dismiss his capabilities. They are the future of our security. The transmission finished. Junessa slumped back against Richie's chest, breathless, the political act exhausting her more than the flight. Done, she managed, her voice thick. Richie held her there, his arms tightening around her waist in a fully possessive, non-negotiable grip. The sound of Zorak's military transport, heavy and loud, was now audible, approaching the Mesa base. They're here, Richie said, his face pressed against her purple hair. It's time for the final performance. Richie secured the comms entrance, sealing Junessa inside the relay station. He took up a firing position at the main entry point to the Mesa summit, his energy rifle ready. The silence stretched thin, punctuated only by the heavy breathing of the human waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Below, the military transports of Commander Zorak and his 8 soldiers landed with a grinding shudder. Zorak, arrogant and rigid, knew this was the trap. But he thought it was a political trap, not a tactical one. He needed to make the arrest look legitimate before the Empress received the distress signal. Zorak's amplified voice echoed up the canyon wall. Richie, the Edict of Possession is hereby revoked due to Imperial discretion. Surrender Princess Junessa and your person immediately or face lethal force. Richie didn't reply. He saw the 8 figures begin their ascent, moving in disciplined, rigid formation. They believed they were facing a cornered, exhausted civilian contractor. Just as the first soldier cleared the ridgeline, a sudden, blinding flash erupted across the sky. The sound that followed was deafening, the jump drive signature of a massive fleet transition. The air immediately filled with the heavy, commanding presence of Cathar Imperial battleships appearing directly over the mesa. Zorak and his 8 soldiers froze instantly, their formation shattering. This was not a response force. This was the Empress's personal armada. The main communications channel crackled, overriding all local frequencies. The signal broadcast directly from the flagship in orbit. The voice of Empress Alara, cold, powerful, and utterly absolute, boomed across the mesa. Commander Zorak, and attached personnel of the Star Guard, including your 8 subordinates. The Imperial Star Guard High Command has been seized. Grand Marshal Krylos is under arrest for treason and complicity in the assassination attempt on my daughter. Zorak dropped his rifle, his mask of control dissolving into shock. The 8 soldiers looked at each other in terrified disbelief. The Empress's voice hardened. Your refusal to engage the perpetrators and your deliberate delay in securing my daughter has been recorded and transmitted. You are stripped of your rank and placed under immediate arrest for complicity in high treason. Zorak sank to his knees, his political game utterly lost. The Empress's tone shifted, becoming measured and powerful. My daughter, Junessa, you are confirmed safe. You are ordered to descend with your asset immediately for extraction. Richie finally stepped out of the shadows, descending the mesa access ramp, rifle lowered, Junessa walking proudly beside him. She looked utterly restored, her posture radiating command. She stopped before the kneeling Zorak. You played protocol, Commander. The human played survival. Survival wins. The commander and the 8 soldiers were immediately surrounded by a fresh wave of loyal Imperial Guard who dropped from the cruisers above. As Junessa and Richie walked toward the awaiting extraction shuttle, the Empress's voice returned, a final decree that cemented Richie's place in the hegemony. In light of the extreme service rendered and the successful application of the Edict of Battlefield Possession, I, Empress Alara, hereby formalize the possession and elevate the status. Junessa stopped, looking up at Richie, a fierce smile touching her lips. Richie, the human contractor, is granted a permanent, personal, and exclusive Imperial contract of protection to the daughter of the Empress. This contract sanctions all necessary physical proximity, all use of force, and all methods required for her survival and security. He is no longer asset. He is her protector. This decree is absolute. Richie looked down at Junessa, seeing the fierce light in her eyes. She had used the moment of galactic chaos to permanently enshrine the intimacy she had been forced to share. He was now the only human male in the galaxy legally sanctioned to hold the Empress's daughter. The shuttle ramp opened. Junessa stepped onto the ramp, then turned, reaching out for Richie's hand. She pulled him forward, their fingers interlocking, a final, public, powerful statement of ownership and protection. The 8 soldiers, now prisoners, were marched away as the human protector and the Empress's daughter ascended into the Imperial fleet. 6 months had passed since Richie carried Junessa from the burning wreckage of the transport. The Viridian Reach was now a pacified, heavily patrolled sector. Krylos, the former head of the Star Guard, was awaiting trial, and Commander Zorak, along with his 8 compromised soldiers, served as a stark public example of the Empress's absolute authority. Richie no longer wore the battered matte gray armor of a contractor. He wore a uniform tailored to the Cathar court, a deep, almost black fabric woven with resilient fibers, bearing the subtle silver sigil of the Empress's personal guard. He was now officially protector to Junessa, a rank that carried more personal weight and political freedom than any general in the hegemony. He was a tolerated anomaly, the only human male allowed within the inner sanctum of the Cathar court. They were aboard Junessa's personal diplomatic cruiser, the Serpentine Will, en route to the Terran Coalition border for Junessa's first major post-coup diplomatic mission. Richie stood sentinel in the observation deck, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the spiral of a nascent nebula. The physical patterns of their relationship, forged in the terror of the jungle, had become their domestic routine. Junessa approached him from behind, moving silently on the plush obsidian floor. She didn't announce her presence. She simply stopped directly behind him, her body close enough for the faint, sweet scent of her species to reach him, a scent Richie now associated with danger, power, and overwhelming attraction. You are restless, Protector, Junessa noted, her voice low, the Cathar title used not as a formality, but as an intimate acknowledgement of their bond. Richie didn't turn. He relied on the subtle shift in her center of gravity to determine her mood. The protocol demands continuous threat assessment. We are moving toward a known flashpoint. The Cathar fleet is strong, but they are predictable. And you are not predictable, she countered, moving one step closer, pressing her back against his. The warmth of her emerald skin radiated through his uniform. This was the most intimate contact they allowed in public, a sanctioned show of proximity that served as both protection and statement. That is why you are the contract, the weapon they cannot measure. She reached up, her small, delicate hand slipping beneath the high collar of his uniform, tracing the line of muscle along his neck and jaw. The public display was technically legal, covered under the decree allowing all necessary physical proximity for her security, but the touch was purely for her satisfaction. You still resent the edict, she murmured, her golden eyes watching the nebula, but her focus entirely on the human she possessed. I was an asset, Richie admitted, his voice a low rumble. Now I am a contract. The chains are polished, Princess, but they are still there. Junessa leaned her head back, resting her purple hair against his shoulder. Then I will make sure the chains are comfortable. You saved the hegemony from implosion. My mother gave you a status that transcends our history. You are the embodiment of human merit, raw competence earning absolute power over our cultural rigidity. No Cathar would ever have dared to claim me the way you did, but you did, and you succeeded. She twisted slightly, turning in the circle of his implied embrace, forcing him to turn fully toward her. Her hand moved from his neck to the front of his vest, her fingers tracing the silver sigil. The greatest power I have is the power to command you, she whispered, her eyes burning with a controlled possessive heat that mirrored the night they had spent in the cave. And you are the only one who knows that my command is truly your desire, that the possession is mutual. She stood on the tips of her toes, closing the final, minimal distance, her mouth meeting his with a controlled fierceness that had become their private language. It was a declaration of power, a seal on the contract, and a silent, sensual reminder of the terror and triumph they had shared. Richie responded instantly, his large hands settling firmly on her waist, pulling her flush against his solid body. The kiss was deep, consuming the space between them. It was a forbidden intensity in the Cathar hegemony, an act of sheer physical dominance that only the imperial contract of protection sanctioned. When she finally pulled back, her emerald skin was flushed, and her breathing was shallow. We have an hour until we reach the Terran diplomatic zone, Junessa stated, her voice trembling slightly. An hour of continuous threat assessment, Richie finished, his voice raw. Junessa smiled, a genuine, predatory curve of her lips. She gave the command he waited for, the command that meant he was fulfilling the highest terms of his exclusive protection. Protector, I command you to take me to the command cabin. The stress of this diplomatic mission is unbearable. I require immediate and continuous psychological relief. I command you to ensure no Cathar is allowed proximity to my person for the duration of this assessment. Richie simply nodded, his eyes dark with immediate compliance. He lifted her easily into his arms, a casual, intimate lift that demonstrated his total physical claim. He carried her out of the observation deck, not running this time, but walking with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who knew he was fulfilling a sacred, necessary contract. He was no longer carrying her from a burning wreck, but into a future of sanctioned, intense intimacy. A human protector possessing the Empress's daughter, forever proving that true survival always supersedes protocol.